Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I wanted to give an extra 5 minutes just in case anybody else wanted to join. I'm sure people can join in if they're a little bit late. I'm really excited to be here. I've been wanting to do this for a while and just not had an opportunity. So I'm glad that we're here, and whoever is here, I hope that inshallah you benefit. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will have a look in a moment and see if I can answer any of those at the end. Today I want to focus on marriage. As a little bit about myself. If you don't know, I don't know who's on. You might know me or you might not. So my name is Nazma Khatun. I'm a UK-based psychotherapist. I've been qualified probably about 18 years. So the areas that I'm trained in are person-centered counselling, CBT therapy, relationship counselling with the Gottman Institute. I've got a certificate in Islamic counselling, and other various like smaller courses like on trauma and other relationship things. I really love the work that I do. It's so fulfilling, and I think it's needed, especially with predominantly I work with Muslims. And I work private practice. I don't work with the NHS or anything because I wanted to be able to include faith. And I think that a lot of our problems can be rooted in faith and also solved in faith. And so I do like to link that in. And I was thinking about this particular thing and how our faith fits into this aspect of relationships. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. You've probably heard of the Gottmans. If you have, I apologise that I'm repeating, but it'd be nice just to set the scene. So I'm going to be today particularly diving into a concept that Dr. Gottman came up with around, and it's not a concept, it's actually research based. So there was a doctor called Dr. Levinson and a Dr. Gottman in 1976, and they came together with like social scientists. So they had the psychology background and the physiology background, and they wanted to combine them to see how they affect relationships. And this particular research went on. What I love about it, and the reason that I chose to train with the Gottmans, is that it's very research based. So lots of evidence, lots of following real couples, and that helps then to navigate when we're working with couples now, because human beings really, we're more or less the same. Strip us back, we have needs and wants and desires. And so what they did was really interesting. They followed couples, hundreds and thousands of couples, over a 20 to 25 year period. And Dr. Gottman became so good at this, looking at the research, looking at patterns of behaviors within couples, that he could predict within a couple of meetings and watching and observing couples whether they'd end up in divorce. And I found that quite phenomenal. I thought that's good, because now we've got a kind of a framework to see which ways of behaving or which ways of interacting, what does it take for two people to make a marriage successful, to have satisfaction in that marriage, versus those that end up divorced. And we're not just guessworking like old wives' tales and things that our parents told us, which is also good, because we need that. We need wisdom. And I don't want to take that away, and I don't want to take deen away, because deen is so important. But it does help us, as a framework to say these things worked for couples that lasted and were happy, and then these particular things, when they were interacting this way or these behaviors showed up, that actually they were unhappy and led to the dissolution of the breakdown of a marriage. And I'm really particularly interested in marriage because I feel like the foundation of our society is based on the family, and I really want families to succeed, to stay together, particularly, the more we live in the West, everything's the individual and nuclear families, and I see the knock-on effect of that later on, whereas families who can stay together, who have that connection, we build the foundation of the society. So I'm really passionate about it, because I want families to stay together. I want couples to stay together and to have happiness in that marriage, not just to it beyond the surface, like we stayed together for 40 years and really underneath there was just so much hardship and pain, and we felt like we had no way out. More so that actually it's such a beautiful thing. All of us know before we got married how the feelings we had and the hopes and the dreams, and every human being, feels that. And so I want that to continue. And sometimes what happens is life goes on and we forget, what was our purpose? Why did we get married? Children come in, and health and wealth and all of these things. And so I want to really focus on one particular area, but a little bit more about the Gottmans before we start. A few fun facts that he actually found out. So what he used to do was he had, at the beginning, he set up these like homes, if you like, but it was labs essentially, but they were houses, like small little houses. And they'd take couples in, they'd invite couples from all over America, and they would observe them. So they had cameras and they observed their like physiological measures. So things like heart rate, skin conductance, which is like if they get sweaty and how their skin is, gross motor movements. So they were observing, slight movements in the person when they were interacting and how they were behaving with each other, and also blood velocity. So, our hearts start pumping, we're really angry or we're anxious or we start to panic. So he was measuring all of these things along with, the interactions of each other. And he found some phenomenal data. And some things he found was, for example, 80% of women, 80% in who bring up the problems in the marriage or there's something wrong is women. So we as women, we tend to bring things up into the relationship. This is not wrong, or can we look at this, or can we fix this? And we find that women tend to be the ones that, because they bring it up, they're seen as the criticizer, they're seen as the complainer. And actually, women tend to do that because they found that the men who were more irritable or the men who were distracted, that's when, if the man was that way, then the woman would show up more aggressive and critical and complain, feels like she's complaining. And so it really links in with Islam. I was really thinking about this, that, the leadership of the man and the way that he shows up and the way that he regulates the house. And this was found in the research. So, and I want you to, before we proceed with this, as I speak about this, we live in a world where you can get this data anywhere. You could go on YouTube and look up the Gottmans and find information about the Four Horsemen. You could read articles. We're constantly bombarded with information. And sometimes, especially me as I sit with clients, they know a lot of things. They're not unintelligent. My clients are not unintelligent. They're clever people. It's just sometimes applying, because there's so many things to do. And actually, if we strip it back and say, I'm going to focus on one particular thing, it helps them because it calms the nerves. You don't feel so overwhelmed. And then you make progress and you feel kind of proud of yourself, like, oh, I changed this one thing. And so when we're going through this, if you are somebody who makes notes, please make notes. But think about one thing that you could take away today and say, actually, that particular thing is something that I'd like to apply. And then be sincere with that, give it a go for the sake of Allah, for your relationship, for you, for your growth. And you don't have to take everything, but it's nice to know it all, but really hone down on what part of this resonates with me, that I feel like, well, actually, I'm maybe somebody who doesn't regulate very well. I get nervous and I get anxious and I show up this way. Or I'm somebody who, can be quite critical. That self-assessment is so important. Don't let shaitan make you feel like, oh, I'm doing something wrong or in shame. No, as Muslims, we want to be knowing what our flaws are. We want to be knowing how to get better with Allah. And Allah loves those who repent. Allah loves those who are humble. And actually, with human beings, we can be kind of ashamed and they make us feel a certain way. They make us feel small, or we have this idea of the self. But with Allah, it's the opposite. The more we are open to admitting our faults, admitting, our shortcomings, the more Allah will help us. So keep that in mind, inshallah. So, okay, so we're going to start. I don't know if anybody, I'm going to open the chat up just to make sure that if anybody has a question. Does everybody know what the Four Horsemen are? The Four Horsemen was coined by Dr. Gottman. And just one second. Okay. So the four horsemen was coined by Dr. Gottman, and it's essentially the way in which I'm looking at a particular part of relationships. There's seven in it. There's like 7 parts to it, and we could not go through all of that. I wanted to particularly focus on this because it's in relation to when we have conflict. It's okay when everything's good and well. People don't tend to talk about that, but the majority of times when I'm getting couples coming in or individuals, it's usually about the conflict. It's usually about the way they're communicating at that point and the pain, some kind of pain that it's causing. I know we have an hour on this call, this webinar, and I'm going to try and break it up so it's like a 10-minute, 10-minute, 10-minute on each one. If you have extra questions, if you need clarification, if you have some wisdom that you want to share on that particular point, please do so, because I'd love the interaction. So I'm going to go through these. So these were called the 4 horsemen in a relationship and how to stop them with their anecdotes. So I'm going to give you how we show up, why it's detrimental, but I want to include the lens of Islam in there. And I think this is the reason I wanted to do this, because I feel like as Muslims, when we have that, it allows us to shift it being that it's kind of this thing between a fight between me and my spouse, or me and my friend, or me and my whoever that other person is in relation, to versus actually this is about me and Allah, This is about, if I do this, I get better with Allah. And it's always a win-win on that. Whatever happens with the relationship, the better we get with Allah, automatically something will change in our outer world. It has to do. So the 4 horsemen, they are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So what Dr. Gottman found was when these 4 things show up in a relationship, it's massive indicators that the relationship is going more towards dissatisfaction, downhill, and towards divorce. Out of the 4, the contempt is the worst. And I'll explain to you why when we get to that. But I want to start off with criticism first. So the definition of criticism, there can be loads, but it's essentially, I put it up in some of the groups, it's a verbally attacking someone's personality or character. And when I thought about this, I want you to think about the word criticism, and I want you to really think about your framing on it. When you think of the word criticism, what comes up for you? Whether that's you criticizing someone or them criticizing you. Does it have a negative connotation? Does it feel like, oh, I'm being attacked? Someone's telling me I've done something wrong. They're being unkind to me. Because when we look at Islam, and I found this really interesting when I was kind of doing some research on it, and I was thinking, what essentially is criticism? Like here, we're talking about verbally attacking the personality or character. But most people, when they're criticizing, they're doing it because there's a need that they've not had met. So I want you to remember that the criticizer, whether you're somebody who gets criticized and feels criticized, or you are the person who can be quite critical. Usually, if you really strip it down, we'll get to the method in a moment, but the core reason for it is that you've not had a need met. You're trying to express something, or you see that that person could be better at something, and therefore, you share that, but you do it in kind of the wrong way. Okay, but the Islamic definition, and this was really interesting for me, was that actually in Islam we have a concept of giving advice and giving feedback, and it's highly encouraged. And so Dr. Gottman talks about this as well, that actually there's nothing wrong with making requests in relationships. We want to be making lots of those, and we want to be constantly sharing. But what happens is that gets blocked because the way in which it's done makes the other person close off. Okay? And here on their definition of it is to have a gentle startup. So you talk about your feelings, you start with an I statement versus you did this or you didn't do that. And then you express a positive need. So what I would have loved is that you came home from work on time, because I know that you've been late all week and it makes me feel like I'm lonely, or that I can't depend on you, which makes me feel quite anxious, or the children wait for you and then they feel disappointed, and we really love to have you at home. So the framing is done in a way where the other person feels like there's a positive outcome to the criticism, versus you're always late, you don't care about us, all you care about is work. And so all you've done is loaded this person with inadequacies and insecurities without any solution. There's no real reason for them to change, because all they've heard is you tell them how rubbish they are, and not anything about yourself or the needs that you have and how they can actually meet that need. And especially if we're talking about women to men with the 80% thing that we talked about earlier, if the woman is the one that's requesting that, then we want to really maintain the dignity and the honor of our husbands, and we want that change to happen. Ultimately, we're bringing that up because we want a change, and what we do is we become powerless. We load all of those things onto them, like you're lazy, you work too much, you're not available for the children, you keep letting them down, versus no, the reality is I really love to have you here. The children love to have you here. I know that and then you get them to open up to really understand that actually I can do something that would make my family happy, would make me feel valuable, make me feel like a lead as a man. And so we hold a lot of power as women in the way in which we communicate. And it's really important that we remember that. Okay, because we're going to bring in up 80% of things. So getting better at that is important. But I want to go back to talking about, this lens of Islam. So we've got the criticism, and as we know, we're allowed to bring things up. We're allowed to be saying we want this improvement, or we're not happy about a particular thing. We absolutely want communication. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, what's happening is that, number one, it's not a gentle startup. So it's coming in harsh with, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, the blame and attacking the personality, you must be lazy, or you don't care. And we want to eliminate that. And we're going to look at what Islam says. So Islam talks about advice and feedback. And I want us to pause for a moment about the times that we bring something up, because what we do is, time goes on, we become familiar with a person, and sometimes we forget that the purpose of the marriage was never about that person. It was about them, us, but Allah. Ultimately, Allah, it's like an umbrella. And what we're trying to do is build something where both of us contribute to getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now if we shift that lens to it being about advice and feedback, how would we do that? What does Islam tell us is the most beautiful way of doing that? What needs to be in place for a person to give feedback? If feedback is encouraged in Islam, which it is, then how do we do that? What is it that we need to develop in ourselves to get good at this? Because we don't want to be avoiding it where we don't tell anybody anything, because that would stifle us in the relationship. We want to grow. We want our partners to understand us, understand our needs and care. The Prophet ﷺ was the most empathetic of all human beings, even to forget his family, to anyone. And we're going to talk about how he listened and other things when we come to stonewalling. But here, we have to really slow down and think, first of all, every time I'm bringing up a complaint, is it rooted in making it better for our deen? Because we get so used to doing it, sometimes it's just the self and the ego. And Shaitan comes in and says, well, he didn't do this for you, or she didn't do that for you. And it just becomes about us. And when that happens, there's no goodness in it, because we don't have anything higher to achieve except the self and our emotion, and aiming for us to feel better in that moment and that person to make us feel better. And ultimately, they can't, Our risk, and part of the risk is love and understanding and care, comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So setting our intentions, this is the gentle startup, the slowing down, the really thinking about, I'm going to bring something up, the mindfulness of it, with somebody, another Muslim, who happens to be the closest person on earth to me after we're married, even more than our parents at that time, because they know so much about us. We live with them day in, day out. They know all our habits. They know every part of us. And so my aim should be to want good for them too. And I want you to really think about this. And the last time you brought something up, did you feel like, forget the other person for a moment, but did you feel like, when I'm bringing this up, I'm doing it from the most loving and truthful place. Like, I'm doing it from a place to help each other? Or was it from a place of, you've done me wrong and I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to come in really fast and I'm going to make sure you know, and the other person has just heard it as a big attack and put up some kind of shield, and you're in a loop, which we call, there's an actual name for it, when, like a gridlock, you're in this loop. And fun fact, actually, 69% of couples in the Gottman, research was found that most of the problems, 69% of problems, are not solvable problems. People learn to just live with them. And we'll come to that, because you might have to assess kind of this particular thing that I keep bringing up. Is it something that's changeable, or is it something that our personalities are just so different that we're going to have to learn to adapt to? But I'll come to that. But that's a fun fact to remember, that some of the things that we're trying to solve are not solvable. And so now it brings up other challenges in our character and our resilience as Muslims, on how do we manage that. Like, not everything's not, this is not Jannah, everything's not going to be perfect, they're not going to have the perfect person. It's about me knowing how to accept that and be grateful for what I have, and that's what Allah's decreed for me. And there are things, obviously, you don't want to continue. Abuse has been one of them. This lack of communication, we want that to foster. So the things that Islam puts in place, going back to kind of the advice and feedback, is this. So I asked us to, number one, check in to see, because Islam says that when we're going to give feedback, it has to be good and truthful. That's number one. It has to avoid evil. And I would write these down, because it's very, very important that we check in on ourselves, because we're doing a duty. Really, if you think about it, we're supposed to be doing something to better our relationship, so that we can worship Allah better, that we can have good interactions with each other. So the first is that it's good and truthful. It avoids evil. It's sincere. And that's, I thought about that one. I thought, how many times do we bring something up and we ask ourselves, am I sincere in this? Or am I just going into attack, and I've got these preconceived ideas about this person, that they're letting me down, that they're not good enough, that they're a certain thing, these labelings, like we talked about Christmas earlier, about character and personality. I've already thought of them lacking in something, and now, no matter which way I present it, it's a character attack versus no, this is, you're coming home late from work, let's see what's going on. This is a solvable problem. And so we have to have sincerity when we're approaching these matters, and care. And there has to be a fear of Allah, which is essentially like selflessness. So when we're going into it, we have to make sure that there is a fear of Allah, that, I'm going in not to attack this person, not to humiliate this person. Because the opposite to that, and I looked at this and it was saying kind of, how do we know the opposite? So if we're supposed to give advice in Islam, it cannot come without that pre-checklist, which is what I've just gone through. But it also cannot have it until these things, it cannot come with enmity. It cannot come with you thinking ill of the other person. There cannot be no cursing, so any cursing, any mockery, any defaming. It can't come with injustice or falsehood. This idea, and I see this a lot, and it's going to be hard because I'm a woman, and so I'm going to say this with as gentleness as possible. So sometimes this can happen with family conflicts. The sister has been wronged by the in-laws. The son still has a duty to them in certain ways, but she gets unhappy because the son still wants to maintain those rights that his parents have over him. But because of the injustice done to her, she goes beyond the limits of Allah, and then, you can't go around, or you can't do this, and that's unjust. We cannot go beyond the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the self. And that's where we have to really regulate and think about, are we safe? Because ultimately Allah is the one that gives us safety. Allah is the one that gives us our ijjat, our sense of self. And that can't come from the human being. It can't come from one right being wronged and then another right, being wronged. We have to keep balance, and we have to trust that Allah knows what is best, and that justice will happen, and that we don't infringe on the rights of others because we felt we were wronged in some way. And that includes our spouse. They might have done something, they might have hurt us, but then equally, if we then go and do a wrong for a wrong, how are we any better? And then we're complaining that they've let us down in some way. So in justice, there can't be any falsehood. And what happens is when these things are not put in place about the truthfulness and the sincerity and the care, is that we actually create extra problems. We create enmity. Sometimes we create rumours. There's character assassination. There's belittling. And sometimes we even go in to punish the person thinking that it's a complaint. But in reality, we've just found a way to punish them. And that's not the way of the believer. That's not the aim of the correction. The correction should be because we genuinely want good for them and we genuinely want, things to be better for the sake of Allah. But we have to check in on our intentions for that to happen. And if they still don't, you've not lost anything. That's the thing I always say. If you're in a relationship where that person doesn't make change, you're making dua, you've tried, then, there'll come a time where because you've practiced this way of being, Allah will open other doors for you. Either He'll give you that contentment within that trial. We know about prophets who were imprisoned, who had sicknesses, and it wasn't that the trial went away, it's that they found peace within it. Or Allah will find a way out for you. Doing it in a way where you're, damaging yourself further, you will only regret that later on because we only take our own deeds to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the main part of this is that the honor of the Muslims should be kept intact. And if you can remember that when I interacted, did I keep my honor and their honor intact? And if I can sincerely say that I did that regardless of their response, then alhamdulillah. And I want you to remember that it might not happen the first time. If you're in a pattern, think about like a bicycle that goes, or something going downhill, it builds momentum. So when you start to make a change, you don't want it to think that, oh, well, I was really nice to them that time and look at how they responded. No, it takes time for people to see that things are changing, to trust, to reverse, conversations to happen about, open conversations around, look, when I share something with you and I bring something up, I don't intend it for me to make you feel small or belittled. My reasons for this is this. I really want our relationship to do well, and I know that you care about me. I know that you want to take care of me, and I want to share what those needs are of mine. And I want to find ways that you can meet those needs, and I know you can. So empowering your partner versus putting them down will help a lot. And, Umar radiallahu anhu used to say, and I want to flip the coin a little bit on the criticism. So now I want to talk about when we're criticized. We all know how that feels. We all know how our defenses can come up. We all know, like, sometimes shame can come up, sometimes our ego, and what we would do if we felt that way. And so I want to talk about the reverse of that, kind of how is the person receiving the criticism, the advice or the feedback in the Islamic terms? What should they be doing? And so Umar used to say, may Allah have mercy on the one who has shown me my shortcomings. He used to love that. He used to love the fact that there is a person there who would allow him to see that, look, you can be better by doing this. And if you can reframe as a couple to say, we want to be better, and the only way we can be better is if we believe that we care about each other, we believe that we want Jannah together, and that we help each other to help one another to teach each other, like, how do you want to be told? How will you listen? Because the opposite to that, what gets in the way of advice is usually your ego, or arrogance or pride. Sometimes it's a false belief. So one of the other pieces of research that Dr. Gottman came up with, that couples that do well are the ones that usually, particularly for men, who are more open to, he uses the word influence, but I don't really like that. But he uses the word influence, the influence of his wife, essentially. So a man who is more open to saying, my wife thinks, this is her opinion, and she thinks this would be good, and he's listening to that. Those couples do better than the kind of men that come in and say, well, I'm the leader, I get to make all the choices, who are you? And those don't do very well. So, and that's part of kind of the Islamic traditions of mashwara and, sitting down and consulting and seeking advice. Ultimately, we have the leader, but to have somebody, especially your wife, and you hear her opinion and you value and you say, oh, that's, she feels important, she feels valued. And so we want to really make sure that we don't have a false belief about that person that then stops us. So if we believe that they're out to get us, then we're going to stop hearing any of the advice. If we believe that, they're trying to shame us or make us feel a certain way, we're going to stop that. So our past voices matter. If we've been criticized previously by a parent or a previous relationship, or you've been bullied, your radar, is going to be kind of on alert. Oh my gosh, like someone is telling something, I'm under attack. I don't want to hear that. And then the other things kick in. So we want to really check in on these kind of vices, these diseases of the heart, like the pride and the arrogance, the ego, when we're hearing that feedback. And we can always request, we can say, look, when you said this to me, the way I heard it was that you were saying, I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not. And so then they can correct and say, no, that's not what I was trying to say. It's not that you're not good enough, it's that this particular thing. And you want to really separate the act versus the person. We can all do things that are not the best, but that doesn't make the person a bad person, because once we can correct that act, then the person feels like, oh, I'm capable of changing something. So it makes them feel better, versus if you just attack the person themselves, then they have nothing to work on because they're like depleted. I'm very aware of time and I've got 4 other things to do. If I don't get through them, we can do another one. I don't mind. But that was the first one, the criticism versus the gentle startup. So really think about that. I think the next one that I would love to talk about is stonewalling. There's defensiveness and contempt, but stonewalling quite interests me. And the reason I'm using stonewalling is that we find that 80% of men stonewall more so than women. And it makes sense. If the woman's 80% criticism, like bringing up all the complaints, and he's overwhelmed by them, men go into stonewalling. And the definition of stonewalling, it's a bit like the silent treatment, but they say that there's a distinct difference on the intent. But I don't know if I agree with that. I think that if we look into our traditions, the Prophet ﷺ had so many beautiful ways of communicating that stonewalling wasn't something that was there, that as far as I could see. But I'm going to go through some of the signs of stonewalling first, and you can see if you're that type of person or if your spouse is that type of person. And I want you to look at it from the lens of compassion as you do this. Not like, oh yeah, I can see now he's a stonewaller. Like, that's it, I'm going to go and tell him. Like, no, it's there's a reason they're doing that, and we want to change that. But first we have to have some compassion, like, okay, this is what's going on, like problem solvers. So signs of stonewalling. This is some of the ones that I've come up with. Number 1 is it's basically a maladaptive coping mechanism. We have healthy coping mechanisms where we can go for a walk, we can say I need some time, we can regulate, and then something happens where we're overflooded. And Dr. Gottman actually saw this, we talked about the physiology. He would see that people's heart rates would be through the roof, and then they just shut down. That you can see we watched videos of this, and you can see this couple and the woman's just bringing up a complaint, and the guy's heart rate is just going up and up and up, and it's getting quieter and quieter. And it's not very obvious. I mean, some are really obvious where they've just shut down and the woman's talking, but it can be very subtle. And it's important that we observe for these things, because if you're noticing that somebody's getting to that point where they're closing off, you don't want to continue talking, because they're not hearing anything. Their heart rate's through the roof. They're shut down, and you're just going to feel further frustrated. So you need to wait till they've calmed down, and we can talk about that. So some of the signs of stonewalling. Number 1 is they abruptly stop responding to you. So they'll just like, I'm not talking, I'm walking away. They turn away while they're speaking. And this is like that really interested me, because the prophetic tradition is the Prophet ﷺ would turn, he'd have eye contact, and you want to be thinking about these things. It's not just about bringing the thing up, but the quality of the relationship, the quality of the interaction when you are talking about something that's difficult to talk about. Have I got my husband's or my wife's attention? Are we in a good place where, we've got eye contact, we're turning in, we know that this, even preface, like saying to, like, this is going to be a difficult conversation, but I don't want to lose you along the way just because it's a difficult conversation. I want to be able to get through this with you. And that takes some effort, but it's well worth it because you'll feel so good if you're able to solve problems together. So you don't want to be so somebody who turns away while you're speaking, they might engage in activities or act busy. And I've seen this in couples in the actual sessions that I've held, where all of a sudden the guy's kind of like turned away and he's playing with, or the lady's just, oh, my baby's crying. And I'm like, okay, we've switched off now. So we want to make sure that you notice these small things that, like, okay, they're engaging in something else. They're on their phone. They're not really listening now. What's happening here? What's happened to them internally that they're not listening anymore? They might refuse to answer questions. They'll interrupt you, to prevent you from completing your sentence or your thoughts. So you're saying something like, no, that wasn't like that. I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't got time for this. So they're coming up with their defenses really fast. As a way to just slow things down, really, because they're overloaded. And again, one of the prophetic ways of communication was we don't interrupt. We allow the person to finish what they're saying and then respond, not to answer everything that they're saying and to have a refutation with it. No, we're really trying to make it so that they have a chance to speak and a chance to share what they need to share. And then they'll declare the conversation is over. They'll pretend that they didn't hear you or ignore you outright. They'll deflect any responsibility and blame you rather than actually discussing the issue. They might even physically leave, so there's no indication as to when they'll be back. And I've noticed a lot where women are in panic. Sometimes they'll say things like, oh, it's over. And it's like the relationship's over. And they give these big statements to just shut everything down. And they might not even, and then you try to text them and you call them, and it's like a cycle. So the more that they shut down, the more, if you have an anxious kind of attachment, you kind of, oh, I need to get hold of them, and you do more and more, and it just makes it worse. You really want to be closing off. And the reason I brought up stonewalling is because stonewalling is often men. They're often flooded, they're overloaded, and it links to the criticism. So if we can get that bit right, often it will reduce the stonewalling. And a part of it is the psychological self-soothing. And it was interesting because a lot of men and boys are not taught really on how to manage their emotions. And again, I'd love to know if you disagree or agree on this, but from the years that I've worked with people, and even just like anecdotal, like family things, girls we talk to each other, we have feelings, we express, but men are not really taught that or learn that. And so what happens is, and they're not bringing up problems, so like the 80% thing again. So in their minds, when something comes up and it's not a solvable problem, they naturally go into this kind of shut down, I'm going to give the silent treatment, I'm not going to engage in this. And it's almost like a self-preservation mechanism. And the alternate to that, the opposite, the remedy, excuse me, is actually self-soothing. And I found this really interesting, that a lot of the men that I've worked with will often say that they're overworked, they're there's so much on their minds, their wives don't appreciate how much they're having to do. And if the remedy is like self-soothing, if you think about all of the prophetic things about the salah, about going for walks and being in nature, those are things that are required, for us to, even before we get into the busyness of this world and this life and families and dealing with things. And also having conversations with our spouse around what actually happens when what do I need to do to help, so that, you can hear me, so that you're not overstimulated, and often they do it because they're avoiding disapproval. So I put up a video the other day. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it was a pastor, and he was talking about men and testosterone, and he was talking about men getting angry, and he said, somebody will come to him. He was talking about in this case relationships. His wife will come to him with something, and he feels inadequate. He feels like he can't solve this problem. He feels it's coming up over and over, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And so you see a lot of men get angry, and that anger brings up testosterone, which then makes them feel manly. But really, what they're doing is avoiding all of those uncomfortable feelings that are brought up that women are pretty comfortable sharing. Like, I'm upset about this, and I'm not happy about that, and I'm in pain for this. We're okay to say those things, and we're not really looking for them to solve any of it, but they don't know that. And so, my thing for this, if I was working with a couple and this was coming up, is to go away and have conversations around what is it you hear when I bring something up? How is it that you take what I'm saying? Do you feel like it's something that you can solve? Do I contribute to you feeling inadequate in any way? Again, going back to the ego and not worrying, this is about the feedback and we wanting to hear to be better. And it's usually the insecurity. Like, I've worked with so many people around abuse, and anybody that knows a little bit of my history, I've gone through a lot. And for a long time, I tried to work out kind of where was the anger coming from? What was it? And I would perceive, on the forefront, you think about these people having really strong character and assertiveness, and, but they're not. They're actually very weak inside. They're very broken because ultimately they feel so inadequate. Their ability to solve a problem or to deal with something isn't quite, matured, or they don't quite know how to. They're not the types that are going to go and talk to anybody about it because that affects their ego and their masculinity. And so now all I've got is to build something up physiologically and attack or get defensive or withdrawing. I mean, if you look at it from like the stonewalling thing, from like the model of bullying, essentially bullies will, I'm not talking to you, that kind of power. It really gives a lot of power. And so it's so detrimental because it makes the other person, the person who's bringing up something, who wants to communicate, who feels like something's not right, and interpreting it as being, negligent or hurtful, or they don't care about me, all of these meanings that we attach, and it just becomes a cycle. And so we really want to get to, if you notice that in your partner, you notice it in anyone, even your children, address it very quickly, because this is really about the inadequacy and the way in which that person feels inside. And if you can help, remember what we talked about, wanting good for one another. If we can let go of our egos and think of ourselves and really think, actually, this person's struggling with something, I might be able to, maybe this is the reason we came together, that person through me can have courage and self-belief, and determination in them that they can do something, and I can be a source of good in doing this, especially as women, because you are the closest and you're a female, and he might not have had lots of females in his life to give him that. And our warmth, what we talk about, the ability for women to have emotions, and men don't have that. They're built to survive and look after us. And when they feel that they can't because of what we're presenting to them, instead of saying, like, I feel like I'm not able, and I'm going to say something funny now. What I find interesting is when people, new couples, I do like premarital counselling, and we're looking for qualities. And I always say this: I say, look for someone who's okay to admit, it feels like those are the softer men, the weaker ones in society. The ones that don't have the aggression, don't have the, they kind of feel a bit mellow. They don't feel very exciting. But actually, they're the strongest of all of the men because they can really regulate themselves. So when you're going to them with, and I know some really good models of this within my family, within friends who have the husbands who show up this way, and you can bring anything to them, but because they have that certainty in themselves, they're not affected by their ability to problem solve. They believe that, everything's okay. They don't feel flooded. They don't feel like they're hearing a criticism of their ego and the link with Allah is kind of like, and I had a husband once say to me, um, the wife said, I had such a go at you. And I said so many things, and you didn't respond, and you didn't say anything. And he said, well, he actually said this. He said, but that would have been my ego, because ultimately all the things you were saying were true. It was just that the way you were doing it was a little bit, you know, but my ego would have come up and I would have said something. And he held himself, and she had, the relationship completely changed because she had so much respect for him. And what that does also is it allows us a mirror. When we don't respond, when we don't correct somebody or we try to fix somebody straight away, we go quiet, we allow that space. Usually, people, when they have time and they're treated well at a time of crisis and they're loved unconditionally, what will happen is they have nowhere else to go but to look at themselves, because you haven't set anything up now. You haven't set up a defense or an attack, or you haven't tried to over explain. You've just kind of allowed them to just be themselves without any resistance. Where else does a person go except back to themselves? Because now they can't say, well, you said this and you said that. Like, all it was is what everything that they said. They have to really face that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing if we can help. I don't know if any brothers are on here, but to know that, to note that the way to actually, for us women, to make our relationships better is by building up the esteem of our men. And we don't do that if we're criticizing, if we're complaining. I know that I haven't covered, I know we're coming to the end, we've got about 8 minutes, and I don't want to keep anybody longer. We all have families and things, and I understand that. But the other two I'm just going to go over quickly. So then there's the defensiveness, which is essentially victimizing yourself to ward off a perceived attack, and then contempt, which is the worst of them. But I might do another one on those two. I didn't realize I'd go so deep into these two. So I'll come back to them. But on the one of contempt is building the culture of appreciation. And I want you to really end with this. The more, how we talked about the projection of the man, so the anger coming through, and it's an inadequacy, and we kind of blame ourselves, and it's really not anything to do with us. I also want to talk about this culture of appreciation, that what starts to happen is once the criticism kicks in and the defensiveness, contempt will kick in. And once we have contempt, and honestly, I once watched one of the videos of Dr. Gottman. I've seen it in relationships, I've seen it in my own life. Like the lips will purse, and the way that the person makes you feel like it's like you're just gum under their shoe. It essentially becomes kind of like, I'm better than you. You're just such a worthless human being, and you start to disdain for the person. But before we get to that, the reason I'm bringing that up is, if we don't deal with the criticism and the defensiveness and the stonewalling, the contempt will come in, because we feel so stuck. And now our survival is at such a risk that we start to then project that outward. And it's such a horrible characteristic to have, but it comes through. And we want to start looking at the opposite of that, which is appreciation and gratitude. And I'm going to leave you with this. I think that overall, if we step back and we reassess kind of what's my goal for marriage, and take our spouses off that center table, that everything evolves around them, and start to look within ourselves and start to think about what's going to create my own happiness. Are there things that I don't actually have to bring up and it's still okay? Are there things that, is there a pattern that I've got of criticism? And can I reverse that to looking at ways of appreciation? Because I promise you, every single human being has some good in them. You have good in you. You wouldn't like it that I wouldn't like it that my husband thought that everything I did was problematic or had a flaw in it or some kind of shortfall, and he doesn't. Like, I'm very blessed. And instead looks at me as a whole human being who's capable and able, and if I do something that and he makes an excuse for me. Imagine a culture that way in your relationship versus looking for, waiting on, seeing what's not there. And that's on us. We can really shift, because everybody's tested. Everybody's going to have something. And our perception is with us, it's not with the other person. It's not because they do or don't do something, it's the way in which we can respond and perceive and shape that reality. And so, my challenge to you, and I think, I remember I said at the beginning, take one snippet, think about all the things we've shared today, and just change one thing and practice it, do it regularly. So if it's, next time I'm going to try and think about the criticism and or I'm going to notice if my husband's shutting down, and in the interaction, do something slightly different. Because once we change that pattern, the outcome will be different. And to start to think about, do I have this focus continuously on the marriage? Or do I have things going for myself too that I want to achieve, that I want to do, that make me feel proud of myself? And also, do I have a culture of appreciation? And it's not about waiting for the other person to give it to us, but it comes from within. So a grateful person, a person who's optimistic, somebody who has things that they look forward to, their aura, their energy is very different to a pessimistic, negative person who's always got, something on, and we are 80%, like we can come up with lots of things to fix. But kind of thinking about it in a positive way, that can be a good thing too. That, yeah, we see like, oh, this is there and that's there, but it can help us to nurture our own self, nurture us as women and our growth. And ultimately, those tests are there to improve, to make us better, to make us stronger. Allah's shaping each of us through those tests. And you want to be looking at it from the lens of that particular challenge that's come up. How does it make me better? Like, does it give me more patience? Does it allow me to, help my husband in some way? Does it allow me to be less critical? Like, it will do something for you. Allah doesn't give us the test to harm us. He's doing it to cleanse us, to make us better, to make us stronger. And you'll find, this, that the people that go through the biggest challenges tend to have the most developed personalities. They're wise and together. And at the time, I see, honestly, and my clients, like, just, I feel so in awe of them. Like, you see them, they think that they're broken and they're going through something, and they're like the strongest people in the world because they've gone through that. And then afterwards, when all that calms down and the wisdom comes through, and they begin to see the wisdom of Allah, and they see who they've become and what Allah has got them through, Allah gives them such a gift that they couldn't have got had they not been hurt by that person, or failed in some way, or rejected in some way, or gone through some kind of hardship. By the very fact that they went through that is what makes them, like, you look at them and you think, oh, how did you get that resilience? Or how did you get through that and you're still smiling, or you're still contributing to community, or you're still being a great mother, or you're still trying to be a great wife, or still doing something. And it's that, because when we're in comfort, believe me, you think that, oh, how lovely it would be to have this comfort life. It wouldn't develop us in any way. Comfort isn't the way that a person gets better. It comes through pressure. It comes through change. It comes through looking at ourselves, the self that we know now being shattered, and then rebuilding of, letting go of that ego that we talked about, letting go of that assumption, thinking that we're right, and really being compassionate to the other person as to what they're going through. So I know that we've come to the end. I don't know if anybody does have any questions. You can unmute if you want to, or you can put something in the chat. I don't mind. But I hope that this was beneficial for everybody. And thank you for joining us, joining me. I really appreciate it. I feel like because we've not had interaction, it would have been nice, but I don't want to put anybody, on the screen and say, oh, do you want to ask something or anything like that. I wanted it to be as anonymous as possible. So Jazakallah khairan. Make dua for each other, make dua for your spouses. I always say this, because the more dua you make, the more love that will enter into your hearts, and compassion. And because of that compassion and love, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring about some change. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And if you would like me to go through the other two, like, it would be nice to hear some feedback, just message me, and then but I think I will do it anyway, and whoever joins with it, I find it really beneficial to look at these things, especially the things that make the marriage worse in times of conflict. It's okay when it's good, but conflict is the area that most people come to us and say, I don't know what's happening here. They're not listening. I'm stuck. I'm frustrated. How do we get out of this? So thank you again, and I will speak to you soon. Assalamu alaikum.